Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you all very much for coming out through the annoyingly unsettled weather. My name is James McDougall. I'm a fellow at Trinity, which is the college that hosts the Humanitas Visiting Professorship in Historiography, and I'm the academic director of the program, which is now in its third year. And we're delighted to have with us Lynn Hunt, distinguished research professor from the University of California, Los Angeles. Professor Hunt's giving a series of talks this week. The next one will be tomorrow evening. A roundtable discussion on histories of the self, which will feature Lynn in conversation with Professor Elika Burma, the co-director of the Oxford Centre for Life Writing at Wolfson College and Professor of World Literature in English, and Lyndall Roper, the Regius Professor of History. Tonight's lecture is on a very topical topic, one getting a good deal of attention in the scholarship at the moment, including an article literally just out by David Bell questioning whether the global turn is a good thing for the French Revolution and indeed more generally. And Lynn's work, as you know, has been at the forefront of thinking about the French Revolution ever since the late 1970s and early 1980s. So I'm sure we're all very anxious to hear what she has to say about the French Revolution in global perspective. Lynn.
Well, thanks so much for coming out and joining in this conversation. I want to begin with two questions about the global perspective to set the stage. Why a global perspective now? And must it be somehow related to globalization as a process? After a brief consideration of those questions, I will go on to talk more directly about the French Revolution. My first two slides show the recent increase of interest in globalization. The first, from WorldCat, shows titles of books in English that include either the US or British spelling of globalization, rather laboriously put together by me doing year-by-year searches on WorldCat. It shows an increase quite precisely at the end of the 1980s and especially the 1990s. The second, a Google Ngram, of globalization in the British spelling, and human rights, which takes only a couple of seconds to generate, depending on your download speed, shows more or less the same thing, with the interesting qualification that the spurt of interest in globalization comes after the corresponding increase of interest in human rights. The WorldCat slide that I began with gives absolute values, the number of titles per year, while the Ngram gives word frequency across millions of texts. This anteriority of human rights suggests that we have become more concerned with globalization in part for cultural and political reasons and not just for economic ones. Globalization is the process of increasing interdependence between areas. It can take various forms: economic, religious, cultural, political. And it has taken various forms, different forms at various moments in the past. Thus, the rise of interest in global perspectives in history might contribute to globalization, even while it is also a byproduct of other forms of globalization in the last 2 decades. In fact, I do not think that the interest in the global is simply a reflection of the process of globalization itself. The rise of interest in globalization is too sudden, coming at the very beginning of the 1990s, whereas globalization as a process has taken place over a much longer term. In my view, talk of globalization filled the vacuum created by the disintegration of the Soviet Union, and with it, the cessation of the Cold War, or at least so it seemed then. Now it's a little bit perhaps more up in the air, and the end of the ideological struggles between communism and capitalism. globalization all too often has been equated with the triumph of capitalism. It has a distinct ideological edge as a concept, which we can discuss later if you would like. By analogy, one might wonder if the rise of interest in global perspectives on the French Revolution represents an attempt to fill the void left by the collapse of the once very powerful Marxist explanation of the French Revolution. This doesn't entirely work at first glance because something else intervened. The Marxist explanation of the French Revolution was undone by criticisms from scholars such as François Furet, who argued that social conflicts could not explain the outbreak of 1789, since nobles helped to fuel it, or the coming of the Terror, since during the Terror, bourgeois politicians fought each other and not the aristocracy, much less the tremendous force of revolution itself, which had its own internal dynamic fueled by ideology and politics, not social division. The Marxist explanation had pretty much collapsed by the time of the bicentennial of the French Revolution in 1989. But unfortunately, there has not been any agreement on what should replace it, as Furet's emphasis on language and politics has now come under criticism for leaving all social factors to the side. The disagreement about interpretive paradigms has left the way open to global perspectives. But those perspectives have not been identified as yet with any particular political or ideological position, such as the vaunting of the superiority of liberal capitalism. Although I will focus in my talk on economic questions, broadly speaking, I do not mean to imply by my choices that globalization is only about economic integration, or that globalization is either to be celebrated or denigrated. The global is on the agenda, plain and simple. Measuring the rise of interest in global perspectives on French history, or the history of the French Revolution, is not easy. My next slide would seem to show, for instance, that the recent increase of publications on the Haitian Revolution is hardly noticeable. You see it down there, barely approaching above the flat line. But a slide, and this is what the problem about the representation of big data, but if we look just at the recent increase of publications on the Haitian Revolution, that is from 1945 to 2008, we see that interest in it, in fact, is a kind of marker of the interest in globalization. It follows a similar path, or even a precursor of the interest in globalization. Interest in the Haitian Revolution rises even earlier than interest in globalization. Is this just following the latest trend, the global turn, replacing the cultural or linguistic turn in history? I frankly do not care much about the answer to that. There is nothing wrong with fashion as long as it is productive of something. Does a global perspective change our interpretation of the French Revolution, or just provide new and interesting information without much payoff? This is precisely the point raised in this recent article by David Bell. We have learned much more about slavery in the French colonies and about the Haitian Revolution, two of the hottest areas right now, but it is as yet unclear how that changes our understanding of the revolution more generally. What I propose to do then is to suggest some ways in which a global perspective can actually change our interpretations. I will not be saying much at all about the French Revolution as an Atlantic revolution or as an example of worldwide processes. R.R. Palmer and Jacques Godechaux's works on the Atlantic Revolution, though they have many virtues, were too focused on politics, and in any case, The Atlantic was not a self-sufficient, self-enclosed region, but linked to wider world markets and cultural exchanges. I do not propose to do what C.A. Bailey has done in his Birth of the Modern World. That is, consider the French Revolution as only a small part of a worldwide crisis that began at the end of the 18th century. For him, the French Revolution is just one example among many, albeit an influential one in the realm of politics, of what he calls the growing imbalance between the perceived military needs of states and their financial capacity. Instead, I want to explore how a global view might change our interpretation of the French Revolution itself. Such an approach, I argue, leads to an even greater appreciation of the French Revolution's distinctiveness and underlines even more dramatically its international impact. But one last caveat. I am going to leave almost entirely to the side the issue of the consequences of the French Revolution because they are so much better known. The revolution had echoes eventually in North Africa, the Middle East, India, Java, the United States, and most of South America, not to mention everywhere in Europe. Explaining why it had those resonances would require a different paper, but I'm happy to discuss that at the end of my talk. I am going to focus on two interrelated issues: empire and government finances. Much more remains to be done on both, so what I have to say will necessarily be suggestive rather than definitive. It is a commonplace to argue that revolution happens in 1789 because of France's imperial competition with Great Britain. Involvement in the American War of Independence supposedly pushed the French monarchy toward bankruptcy. While imperial competition is clearly a necessary factor, there would have been no revolution if the French had not had imperial aims. I am not convinced that it is a sufficient one. The French government, after all, did not go bankrupt immediately after the end of the American War in 1783. Global commerce has to be factored in. An enormous expansion of overseas trade after 1783 enabled the French government to borrow more and more money, in particular from foreign sources, mediated by an influx of foreign bankers to Paris. Here, economic and political things come together. The foreign bankers came in part for political reasons, fleeing turmoil in Geneva, Amsterdam, and Brussels in the 1780s. They helped fuel a speculative boom unleashed by government ministers in the mid-1780s. The bursting of the bubble, and in particular, the pamphlet war surrounding it, effectively delegitimized the government and opened the way to constitutional revolution. The role of foreign bankers agitated public opinion even then, in the years before 1789, as I will show. And it would go on to fuel fears of a vast foreign plot during 1793 and 1794, the years of the Terror. I will discuss the foreign plot in the second half of my paper. Bailey's emphasis on the growing imbalance between the perceived military needs of states and their financial capacity is, for me, too general. Crucial is how this imbalance was addressed. It now appears that the French monarchy was no worse off than its British counterpart in 1788. Now, this sounds a little dry, but it actually has to do with the future of nation states, so bear with me. While the proportion of debt service to tax revenues was slightly higher in France, the ratio of debt to GNP was much lower in France, as was the ratio of taxes to GNP. By the way, French administrators were deeply concerned with just these issues, as my next slide shows. Last summer, I came across, completely by accident, these documents in the British Library. They had been moved from the Foreign Office to the British Library about 20 years ago. It's called British Library Additional Manuscripts 74,100, a look at the balance of commerce of France in the year 1789. 5 giant handwritten sheets, 40 inches by 26 inches, which I spent a considerable amount of time trying to track down exactly where they came from. I'm pretty sure they were copies made of charts, not charts, but of data commissioned by Necker for the use of the Estates General in 1789. I have developed just a very few charts to show you today based on that handwritten raw data, and I want a lot of credit for having stood over these charts with my computer, entering this stuff into Excel sheets while sort of trying to reach the top of the chart and ruining my neck and back in the process. So just think of that when you see the beauty of these nice blue charts, these nice blue columns reaching up from Excel. I have to, of course, call my sister periodically, who's a computer person, to have her explain to me how to exactly make Excel charts, but I finally succeeded. What you can see, this is just to show you, is that the ministers are gathering data on every country in Europe. They're also developing data on the Ottoman Empire at the same time. That's their orbit. Their orbit is Europe and the Ottoman Empire, on exactly what they're spending on their military, Army and Navy combined, but this is especially the Army, exactly what their general revenues are. I mean, this is incredibly detailed comparative information because they are very worried about, exactly where does France fit. My view here is that they are probably happy that France is in the middle and not like Russia spending a massive amount relatively, and Prussia on its military. And the ratio of general expenditures to population, they're probably happy to be high, along with England especially and Holland. This showing that the government is able to spend a lot of money on domestic things and not spend all their money on the military. Okay, the one difference between France and Britain that everyone seems still to agree on is that the British and Dutch could borrow at a lower rate of interest than the French. Around 3% for the Dutch, 3 to 3.5% for the British, and between 5 and 7% for the French. But even this fundamental difference has a history to it. Francois Velde and David Weir have shown a kind of convergence, which I have circled in red, trying to learn my PowerPoint techniques, in borrowing rates in the mid-1780s, convergence that underlines the importance of what happens just at that moment. So I'm arguing that after the war, in fact, the French are quite well off, and the gap between them and the British in terms of borrowing is in fact narrowing. Thanks to the internet accessibility of sources, such as the slave trade database, we now know more precisely how much French commerce took off in the 1780s. And in fact, this has revolutionized our understanding. Because what it shows is that while the British dominated the slave trade during the American War, you can see that the blue is much higher than the red during the time of the American War, the French promptly recovered and even surpassed the British in the late 1780s. It was completely unknown before this database was developed that the height of the French slave trade is in fact the years right before and at the beginning of the French Revolution. Similarly, studies of Indian Ocean trade indicate increasing French presence, even though the French had suffered great losses in India as a result of the 7 Years' War. Administrators were obsessed with these figures. I'm not going to tax your patience with my very many slides from that British Library source, but I have to show one more because it's fascinating on the problems of statistics as well. The French calculation of colonial commerce. If I had more time, I could show you that they have this broken down in incredible detail, exactly which regions of India produced which amounts of income for which powers, exactly which Caribbean colonies produced how much income for which European powers. I'm just showing you the overview, which, surprise, shows French colonial commerce as just slightly ahead of the British in 1788. This is probably a somewhat rosy view of the relative situation, and they attribute it to Saint-Domingue, the colony in the Caribbean. My argument then is that the amount of capital available was increasing dramatically, and not just in France. And the number of brokers interested in bringing it into French government hands was also increasing. I cannot give you hard data on the number of foreign bankers, but a few examples will help make my point. When the Caisse des Comptes, a national discount bank, was established for the first time in 1776, 5 of its 7 administrators were Swiss in origin. The finance minister Calonne re-established the French East India Company in 1785, and by 1787, at the latest, some of the leading foreign bankers in Paris had become agents for the shareholders, official agents for the shareholders. The Dutch banker Jean-Baptiste van den Iver and the English banker Walter Boyd, in particular, both of them operating out of Paris, and Boyd is going to be figuring a lot in the second half of my talk. Shares in the East India Company, like shares in the National Discount Bank, the Water Company, and 3 new insurance companies, all rose in value precipitously after 1785, only to crash in 1787. In a futile attempt to stave off this collapse, which the government saw coming, Calonne funneled more than £11 million in treasury funds to a syndicate he instructed to buy up East India and Water Company shares in order to shore up the prices. Outmaneuvered by one of his chosen agents, who instead set up his own secret investment group to corner the market, Calonne ended up losing nearly £25 million for the government and being himself fired. I have focused on the activities of one of the foreign bankers in this crisis, the Swiss Etienne Clavière, because his account books were confiscated when he was arrested in 1793. Although these registers do not cover the entire time period in question, they are suggestive. Clavière moved to Paris in 1784, and before long was dealing in extraordinary sums of money, especially since he was essentially a private investment banker with no actual bank. This is what I have derived from his livre de caisse. This is just the total amounts that he's dealing with. As you can see, takes off suddenly in 1786 and reaches extraordinary amounts of millions of pounds. Now, Clavière was a short seller. The French even had a word for it then, a baissier. That meant that he actually owed more than he owned outright. He was a short seller, which is why, in this chart, his obligations are considerably higher than his actual investments. His gambles could either constitute a bet on the share price. He would borrow shares, sell them at a high price, repurchase them at a much lower value, and return them to the borrower and pocket the difference. Or he would bet, in the case of the National Discount Bank, on the dividend that would be paid, hoping again that the rate would lower over time. Not surprisingly, given the size of his investments, Clavière kept up a frenetic pace of correspondence. Between the 28th of January and the 23rd of December, 1785, he wrote 526 letters to 83 correspondents in 25 different European cities. He wrote fewer letters in 1786, but still counted 72 correspondents in 23 different cities. Clavière did not trust to the market to achieve his aims, so he fed information and probably even pages of prose to Mirabeau, who wrote pamphlets against speculation in shares of the new Spanish Bank of St. Charles and the new water company, and later to Brissot, who published pamphlets against the water company and a proposed fire insurance company. Clavière hoped to benefit from a resulting decline in share values, and he also wanted to set up his own water and insurance companies. He played a leading role in the formation of two new insurance companies, one against fire and one for life insurance. The idea itself was new in France at the time. Having lived in Great Britain after his exile from Geneva in 1782 until he moved to Paris in 1784, he had learned about actuarial tables and saw an occasion to profit from his new knowledge. He and his allies had the right contacts at court to get the projects approved, but the schemes hardly got off the ground before 1789. Needless to say, his mouthpieces did not attack his companies. For all his efforts, Clavière could not always correctly time the market for company shares, and in the end he preferred investing in French government debt. For, as he said in one of his letters, the high rates of interest make up for the risk. So you see that in French bonds he has more than £2 million invested. Clavière wrote these words about risk in April 1786 to one of his biggest creditors, Peter Stadnitsky, an Amsterdam banker who had loaned Clavière more than £500,000. Stadnitsky is a fascinating character because he was, I have discovered, one of the chief funders of the debt of the new United States. Almost the entire new U.S. debt was held by Dutch investors at the beginning of the Republic. Mirabeau, Brissot, and Clavière all gained reputations as righteous denouncers of market speculation, whereas Calonne lost his job and the rates on government loans increased to ruinous levels, between 7 and 10%. Yet insiders knew that investors were mounting pamphlet wars for something other than high-minded ends, which we can now find thanks to searchable literature databases. When Mirabeau's pamphlet against speculation appeared in March 1787, just as the Assembly of Notables was beginning its deliberations about how to solve the French financial problems, a widely read underground newsletter seized upon its significance of Mirabeau's pamphlet. Here's what they said. What renders his zeal even more suspect is the adroitness with which he only unleashes his lightning bolts of eloquence against those who are playing for a rise in the market. Such a pronounced partiality has not failed to make people suspect those betting on decline, Clavière, Panchaud, and others, these are Swiss bankers, of having once again solicited this latest production at the same price for which they obtained previous ones, unquote. The editors of the underground newsletter nonetheless worried that the damage was done. Mirabeau's vitriolic denunciation of Calonne and his prediction that the finances of the country would be ruined and bankruptcy therefore inevitable had provoked public indignation and undermined the financial credibility of the government. The notables would refuse to accept projects for fiscal reform without a full accounting, and in an atmosphere of expanding uncertainty about the government's true financial state, anonymous pamphlets now ridiculed not only Calonne, but also the notables. In the end, then, the combination of speculative excesses and the linking of them to the government through pamphlet wars played a greater role than the deficit itself in bringing down the government. Calonne's successors could not staunch the blood, and the door opened to revolution and the promise of massive fiscal reorganization. The machinations of bankers, foreign and French, and the pamphlet wars that sapped the government's credibility were not the only factors bringing on the upheaval of 1789. I am not saying this is it alone. Massive unemployment in the textile sector that followed the free trade treaty signed with Great Britain in 1786, and poor harvests in 1788 and 1789 inflamed both urban workers and peasants who could not afford to feed themselves. When the constitutional crisis began, the popular classes were ready to make their voices heard, whether in riots or meetings held to gather up their grievances in preparation for the Estates General. The intervention of the popular classes radicalized the revolution that unfolded. But there would have been no revolution if the nation's creditors, both foreign and domestic, had not lost confidence in the government. After the revolution began, the issues of the government's debt and the international bankers' role in it did not disappear. In 1789, Clavière argued strongly against the repudiation of the crown's debt. He had more than £2 million invested in it. We could see why this might be true. And in 1792, this is the part that is the real shocker, he became finance minister. Arrested as one of the Girondins on the 2nd of June, 1793, he committed suicide before he could be tried. By the end of 1793, many foreign bankers had fled, been arrested, or executed. Global finances would be as crucial to the unfolding of the French Revolution as they had been in causing it. Nowhere was this more apparent than during the so-called foreign plot. This is an incredibly convoluted story, much too convoluted to tell in detail here. And in any case, my interest is not in the specific connections between the Baron de Batz, the supposed instigator of the foreign plot, the Comte de Prolly, the Belgian Jacobin now thought to be an Austrian agent, the falsification of the decree to liquidate the Indies Company yet again in 1793 that brought down various very left-wing deputies, or the links to the Hébertistes and Dantonists. What interests me is rather the relationship between the fear and reality of foreign conspiracy and the instability of revolutionary finances. It is hardly coincidental that Batz and Prolly were major speculators in the 1780s, or that Batz became the head of the new National Assembly's committee to liquidate the national debt. In 1789, the new National Assembly chose not to repudiate the debt of the old regime. Even while it swept away the nobility, the venal offices, and the previous system of taxation in its entirety, it took over the debts of the monarchy and added to them by agreeing to reimburse former office holders. But it chose not to do so by consolidating the myriad forms of debt into a long-term public debt run through a national bank, which is what happens in the United States. Through an extremely complicated series of events, there is a national bank and a long-term public debt. The deputies in France rejected Necker's suggestion that the notes of the discount bank be increased and circulate throughout the country, and not just in Paris, as legal tender, as paper money. They feared the influence of Genevan bankers, and so preferred the solution of what were called the assignats, which were not originally intended to circulate as paper money. They were supposed to be certificates that gave you the right to a certain amount of the land that had been confiscated from the clergy. So there's an enormous amount of uncertainty about exactly what these pieces of paper were meant to be. The new republic attempted to finally consolidate the debt in August 1793 by ordering the establishment of a great book of the public debt, offering 5% interest, which constituted a partial default on some debts which were paying a higher rate of interest than 5%. The National Convention that had been elected in September 1792 had already tried to get a handle on speculation and limit the competition for capital by closing the Paris Stock Exchange in June 1793. And in August, it also suppressed all private shareholder companies, including the National Discount Bank. The aim of their great book of the national debt was to liquidate the debt, not fund it permanently. Old habits proved hard to uproot, however. Although the Treasury gradually established control over financial operations, it could only report on an increasingly disastrous situation that continued to attract speculators, who sometimes got help from the deputies themselves, as in the case of the liquidation of the Indies Company. Many of the financial players from the late 1780s continued to operate in Paris after 1789. Among them was the Scot, Walter Boyd, who will have to serve as my prime example, though he is hardly chosen randomly, since Boyd and his partner John Kerr were the famous English bankers denounced in the report on corruption of March 1794 that outlined the supposed foreign plot. So they were supposedly the bankers of the foreign plot. Boyd had been an assistant manager, along with Kerr, of a new private bank in the Austrian Netherlands, set up in 1782 by Edouard de Valquier, who was of the famous Belgian banking house called Veuve Nettine et Fils, and William Harries, brother of one of the biggest bankers in London. So you see that in the 1780s, this is going on not just in France, but as a kind of more general West European phenomenon. In 1785, Boyd and Kerr set up shop in Paris, probably with help from their friends. And they soon became among the most successful of Parisian bankers, negotiating sales of French state bonds for foreigners and collecting payments for them, arranging massive loans for the Duc d'Orléans and other leading aristocrats, providing banking services for British travelers, and fighting for control of the banking services associated with the Indies Company, of which Boyd was for a time an agent, as I mentioned before. These activities only accelerated after 1789. They acquired important new limited partners. Boyd's cousin, Walter Boyd Jr., Valquier, who had originally helped set them up, and Valquier's cousin, François de Laborde de Méréville, son of one of the most prominent bankers in Paris, whose mother also came from the Belgian Nettine family of bankers. Méréville became a deputy for the Third Estate in the Estates General. Boyd and Kerr bet on the decline of the assignat through manipulations arranged with bankers in Amsterdam, London, and Hamburg. They imported silver from London and Cadiz in Spain in order to sell it above par in Paris. It was at the time only illegal to do this with French gold and silver. And they provided money for speculation on the coffee and sugar markets because prices had risen dramatically after the beginning of the insurrection in the colony of Saint-Domingue, present-day Haiti. Laborde's father had made part of his fortune in the transatlantic slave trade and owned plantations in Saint-Domingue. And Valquier had also participated in the slave trade. In the first years of the Revolution, Boyd and Kerr continued to do business with leading émigré aristocrats such as Calonne, who had fled to London. Indeed, Kerr became the lover of the wife of the Swiss Baron de Bienne, and she ended up being executed for conspiring with émigrés in January 1794. Although the two Boyds, Kerr and Laborde, eventually fled to England, they continued to do business in Paris through their chief clerk, Antoine Grégoire Geneste, who was made nominal owner to circumvent an October 1793 decree ordering the arrest of all British subjects and the confiscation of their property after the declaration of war against Great Britain. When Geneste was arrested and condemned, the prosecutor, Fouquier-Tinville, described him as an agent of the faction of foreigners and of the bankers. The letters seized at his home were dated between September 1793 and March 1794, And they showed, again, it pains me to put this all on one nice little map, having spent endless hours trying to figure out what these letters were about. It showed that he was carrying on various monetary transactions on behalf of Boyd and Kerr with 129 correspondents in 51 cities, so even more far-flung than Clavière, even in that deeply dangerous period of the Terror. The amounts in question ranged from a few pounds to a few $100,000. Boyd Sr. had written to Geneste in the vaguest terms, no doubt fearing that the letters would be read. From his new perch at Boyd, Benfield and Company, established in March 1793 in London, with money that the notorious Indian nabob Paul Benfield had laundered through Boyd and Kerr in Paris. In 1794, Boyd can be found arranging a £4 million loan for the Austrian government and an £18 million loan for the British government, two of the most colossal transactions of the entire epoch. This is somebody who started as assistant manager at a far-flung branch of a bank in Europe. Both Benfield and Boyd Sr. eventually sat as members of Parliament. Despite their close connection with William Pitt, they went bankrupt at the end of the 1790s, as did Vauquier on the continent. Boyd and Benfield went to France. I love this story. Boyd and Benfield went to France during the Peace of Amiens in 1802 in a vain effort to recover their assets from Boyd, Kerr and Company, only thinking that the Napoleonic regime would be much more favorable to them than the regime of the Terror, only to find themselves interned as hostages once hostilities recommenced. Benfield died in poverty in Paris in 1810. Boyd was finally released in 1814, 12 years later, and he then, this is how we're able to follow him, he then submitted various claims to the British government for reimbursement of the seized assets of his original Paris firm. Many of the claims were granted, and in 1823, Boyd re-entered Parliament. He died in 1837, leaving an estate worth £200,000, in the end, once again, a rich man, thanks to the recovery of his French assets. Was Boyd actively conspiring against the revolution while in France? Albert Mathiez described him as, quote, suspected with great likelihood of being an agent of Pitt, end quote. But he actually meant Boyd Jr., the cousin, having conflated the two completely because they had the same name. Or was Boyd just trying to make money, as bankers do? Munro Price has discovered a telling passage in Axel Fersen's diary. Axel Fersen was the supposed lover of Marie Antoinette, that was omitted from the published version. It was written in April 1792. I quote Fersen's diary. The Baron de Batz, there he is again, writes from Paris that nothing is ready nor will be before 20th May. This Baron de Batz is an intriguer, but he, Laborde de Méréville, Boyd and Company, and Vauquier, I'm still citing the diary, have a member of the Jacobins' secret council on their payroll who tells them everything, unquote. Boyd's ties to Pitt seem to make the talk of Pitt's money, it was always referred to as argent de Pitt, funneled through Batz, credible. But Boyd's ties to Pitt are only apparent after the banker returned to England in 1793. Even Fersen's previously unknown testimony is hardly conclusive. Bankers always want inside information, especially when war is looming. There is no question that Boyd, Kerr and Company worked for and with leading aristocrats, including the Austrian foreign minister Mercy Argenteau. Yet in all the lengthy back and forth in England about Boyd, Kerr and Company claims, and there were countless documents submitted to the commissioners for liquidating British claims on France and on appeal from their judgment to the Privy Council as well, all of which can be easily found, there does not seem to be any evidence offered by the claimants that they were serving the interests of the British government in any direct fashion, and they had every reason to announce that they did. Indeed, more energy was spent explaining why Geneste's name this is the poor guy who takes over and is executed, appeared on the annuities they were claiming as their personal property. The firm had put them in Genest's name because his first name was Antoine, and the dividends on the annuities were paid in alphabetical order based on the first name of the holder. The main question here is not whether the British or other bankers conspired against the revolution. In fact, most bankers greeted 1789 with equanimity, if not enthusiasm. Valquier, for example, came to Paris because he had taken the side of the revolutionaries in Belgium against the Austrian emperor. Although some bankers survived the French Revolution without fleeing, most found themselves suspect after the declaration of war in 1792 against Austria, and not a few, like Genest, were executed as traitors. There is no doubt that in some sense the bankers did conspire, if only because their interest was in making money, not in stabilizing the assignats or consolidating the debt under the Treasury's control, much less eliminating speculation. By the nature of their trade, they were in correspondence with foreigners, some living in countries eventually at war with France. The map of Genest's contacts makes this abundantly clear, for they were almost all located on the periphery of France or in actual hostile territory. My point, rather, is that the reluctance to establish a central bank and tie a permanent, not temporary debt to it hobbled the revolutionary government. Without a central bank that could use private capital to guarantee government investment, investors, that is voters, were reluctant to put their money in government instruments. It became clear by the beginning of 1792, at the latest, that the assignats could only be viewed as speculative instruments since their value was unstable. They had already lost a quarter of their value. The government had in effect created millions of speculators, and then under the Republic tried to eliminate speculation itself. Pierre-Joseph Cambon, one of the financial experts of the Legislative Assembly and the Convention, explained the Republic's policy in a speech in August 1793. I'm quoting him. "There is at this moment a struggle to the death between all the money men and the consolidation of the Republic. We must therefore kill all these associations that are destructive of public credit if we want to establish the reign of liberty." End quote. Crédit public, public credit, was certainly the issue. The real question was how to establish it. The value of the assignats fell from about 50% of face value in January 1793 to only about 25% in August 1793, rose again to nearly 50% by the end of 1793, but declined steadily in 1794 down to 20%. In the absence of a permanent public debt linking the Republic to its voter creditors, the very idea of commerce in money became problematic, even repugnant, and its continuing existence gave rise to fears of foreign plots, precisely because commerce in money was by its nature international and hidden from public view. Genest's interrogation by the Revolutionary Committee of his Paris section captures the conundrum with some poignancy given his fate. He was asked, according to the draft of the interrogation, "Tell us what moves the English are making to pass funds to those they might owe money to in France." Responded that he did not know of any other means than to go to bankers in Brussels or other locations. They sent assignats into France. End quote. When queried about his views on political affairs, he replied, "He thinks one must live or die." Those dealing in money were more likely to do the latter. When French finances are put into the international context in which they in fact operated, some of the most fundamental elements of the revolution, such as fears of conspiracy and uncertainties about how to finance the Republic, can be seen in a different light. What would have been a difficult situation was, of course, greatly exacerbated by a far-flung war effort. Even Pitt had to borrow money from private sources through the offices of Walter Boyd, among others, to finance the British war against the French. Without a national bank, and with little interest in negotiating with private holders of capital, the French faced even greater difficulties in funding their side of the conflict. One of the well-known consequences would be the gradual erosion of any notion of republican financing. Though the Directory government began developing plans for a national bank, set up by Bonaparte in 1800, by 1797 it had eliminated paper money, repudiated 2/3 of the public debt, and reintroduced various forms of indirect taxation to make ends meet. It also relied more and more on tribute wrenched from the newly conquered territories by its armies. Bonaparte would keep moving in the same direction in some respects, only faster. I have tried to demonstrate in concrete detail, perhaps more concrete than you really thought you were going to have to hear, that financial markets in the 1780s were already international, even global in terms of circulation of silver and bills of exchange, and that they exerted influence on domestic politics, causing the Revolution, shaping the Terror, and eventually even the reign of Napoleon. Recent work by historians and political scientists has highlighted the hidden symbiosis between public debt and representative government. In the 18th century, most political thinkers and politicians, from Thomas Jefferson to Napoleon, abhorred the idea of a permanent state debt. And yet, like political parties, equally disdained, it turned out to be foundational for modern representative government. Much remains to be done in exploring that connection, which is best understood, I argue, as a global problem already in the 18th century. Thank you very much.